I want to take a look at a passage, 1 Peter 3, verse 13 to 16, and from Luther. But first I'll read the passage. And who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. And Martin Luther says this. He says, you may say there is something that no one knows or believes. Therefore, it is necessary to wait until it is decreed what one should accept. Answer: meanwhile, you will also go to the devil. And literally in German, dox zum Teufel. For when you are lying at death's door and know what to believe, neither I nor anyone else can help you. You yourself must know to escape hell. Interesting passage to preach that text from. But I think it's appropriate. In a sense, he was doing that very thing. He was, for the sake of righteousness, suffering quite a bit. And as you look at Martin Luther's ministry and life, you see that there were more than one occasion that he was only hours away from death. By the pursuit of the Romans, or the Roman Church, by the pursuit of Charles V, by sickness. And Luther endured, and he was given opportunity. And his understanding was that God would give him the words. And you see it time and time again that God would give Martin Luther the words in his defense, the words in his disputations, the words at the Diet of Worms. Now, he himself criticized the way he handled himself at the Diet of Worms, but he wasn't given an opportunity to defend himself at all. He wasn't there, nor was he wanted to be there. Nor did the position want him to be there. All he had to do was bring an indictment against him. The Diet of Worms in 1521, was the sole purpose for that was to by empirical court, to declare Martin Luther as a heretic of the same caliber as John Huss. Now, what that did was that immediately brought condemnation of life. He told Charles and his benefactor, Frederick the Wise, he told him that he was going to attend, but to be given an opportunity to dispute. And yet, that was not the case. That was not the case. All they were there to do was bring an indictment. of condemnation. But as a result of that, Charles V gave Martin Luther a guarantee of safe passage. He gave him, after he attended, he gave him 21 days of safe passage. But what occurred was very interesting. Charles kept his word. But to Martin Luther's entourage, there were many of them, including close to 4,000 troops of his supporters, the prince's supporters. Excuse me, not the prince's supporters, but Luther's supporters from amongst the princes. That Charles V had made mention, I gave Luther free passage, but to his Wittenberg buddies not. And so that scattered the academicians from Wittenberg. Charles kept his word, though, and gave him 21 days before he made an empirical edict that anybody who killed Martin Luther would not be punished. Now, that is biblically, that is the same thing that happened to Cain and to those who were to kill him later. But there was a provision saying this, that anybody who killed Cain, then they too were under that indictment. Well, that would not be the case with Martin Luther. So he was a hunted man after that, right after the Diet of Worms. And we'll talk briefly about the Diet of Worms. But right after the Diet of Worms, on his way back from Worms, he was kidnapped by Frederick and taken to his castle. And there he was introduced to his staff as Sir George. And he was held there for about 2 years. This was 1520, later part of 1521, 22, and 23. During that period of time, the radical reformers in Wittenberg take the charge of the Reformation. And I find it interesting that Philip Melanchthon didn't take charge of the Reformation at that time. But there's a funny thing about Philip Melanchthon. One, he really needed Luther to shine. He needed his friendship with Martin Luther to shine. And he really wasn't one to take control or take lead of the entire Reformation. Where Karlstadt, Andreas Karlstadt, used his seniority in Wittenberg to grab the lead. And in so doing, the Reformation almost went amok. There was fanaticism, there was radicalism being expounded from Wittenberg. They started a licensed lifestyle, a licensed style. They did absurd and immoral things to make a point. Well, one of the disturbing factors for Martin Luther was this radical lifestyle that they had taken on. And that was the very thing about the corruption of Rome that Luther opposed. that biblically. Reformation was taking a bent that he did not have in mind. Luther never, and I want to repeat that, never flogged a social reformation. Many of the other reformers flogged the social reformation. In fact, that was one of Martin Luther's criticisms with Zwingli, was that he became a socialist, and that his Reformation, even though it was in line, in a sense, in line theologically, that it was completely, its complete focus was a social reformation. And that may be misconstrued, but I'm sure that Martin Luther had had a good understanding of the history at hand. But because Switzerland was one of those kingdoms, was one of those empirical regions that was set up and established through commerce, and that made they did not have a feudalism per se, similar to Geneva. Zurich did not have a feudalism. It was ruled by council, not by baron or not by prince. Now, some of the council members were lords, granted. It's very similar to the House of Lords in England. But there was no ruling monarch. So, in a sense, Zurich was already socially reformed. So was Geneva. My contention is this. Well, I'm sorry, I can't say that about Zwingli, because he died in battle fighting the Roman church soldiers. But Calvin's Reformation stood on the power of Geneva, and that economic power was also political and military might. And so as a result, Geneva was really left alone, in a sense. And that's one of the reasons why Presbyterianism in a John Calvin way survived in Europe. It even had some inroads into France, of which you'd refer to them as the Huguenots, but they suffered some pretty nasty blows themselves in France. France was really the battle axe of Rome, and France would remain the battle axe of Rome. That a Reformation movement, even though it be large, would suffer at the hands of French kings. The French kings kept that as part of their standard orders to preserve the papacy. Certainly they had a vested interest in that. They prospered greatly from the papacy. They themselves seized and acquired all of the property earlier, Knights Templar in France. which was an incredible sum of money and an incredible amount of property. There was a time in France, Knights Templar owned or controlled as much as 40% of the entire wealth of France and close to 35% of the entire properties. Now that is quite a sum to hand over. By the way, back then the Pope he gave it into the hands of Philip to keep for the church. Which, of course, we know what that is, to use it for his own account. But at the Diet, this is one of the statements that Martin Luther made. He was asked by Charles V to recant, and he said he was asked to recant for all of the writings that he had made, and that was quite a sum, as I mentioned earlier. Martin Luther replies, "Unless I am convinced by the Scripture and plain reason, I do not accept the authority of popes and councils, for they have contradicted each other. My conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. God help me. Amen." Now, he himself, Luther himself, criticized his performance there, but again, he was not given a position to do anything but recant. He wasn't allowed to go there to do anything else. When he left the room, he stated, "I am finished, have come through." And then Luther went home, and of course Charles had given him the safe passage. And then Frederick had him kidnapped, understanding full well that his life was in danger. It was actually one of the bishops of Mainz who had said to Frederick that you do not want to lose Martin Luther, that the day that Martin Luther is lost is the day that Christianity is lost. And so Frederick, taking that to mind, had Martin Luther kidnapped and took him to his castle as Sir George. In that time, of course, Martin Luther didn't rest. He didn't say, "I'm finished. I have come through." That was the time that he took to translate the Scripture into German. And translate he did. He translated the entirety of the Testament from the Greek text, and I want to emphasize from the Greek text. He used the Latin. There are some who will say, "Oh, he used the Latin," but that is not true. Martin Luther did not use the Latin. And it is very evident when you look at his translation that he didn't use the Latin, because he has no Latinisms in that text. while I was in Germany, I got Luther's translation. I picked it up. I'm kind of stubbing my way through that and looking at certain passages I know are Latinisms in English, in the English text, and they just aren't. They're very nicely done in the German translation, in Martin Luther's German translation. I haven't checked them all out yet, but gosh, maybe within the next 2 years or so, before you all graduate, maybe I'll have checked them out and given you some indication of that. As I had stated earlier, radical reformers took the lead, and somewhere around 18 months after his kidnapping, Martin Luther pays a visit to Wittenberg incognito, and he comes back not liking what he saw, and so he comes out of retirement, so to speak. But remember, he was not retired. He was writing the whole time and translating the whole time. When Martin Luther gets back to Wittenberg, he cleans house in Wittenberg. And the radical reformers are kind of pushed out. And this is where things start to go bad for the Reformation. As a result, in the year 1524, 1525, two of the radical reformers, and I want to emphasize one in particular, Thomas Müntzer. But the other one, Andreas Karlstadt, had something to do with it, not as much as Müntzer. But Müntzer leads, really, the peasant revolt. And the peasant revolt wasn't just a small affair. And I think that we maybe erroneously think that this is just something that happened in Detroit in 1968. Well, no. It's on a much greater scale. For instance, the end battle in 1525, the Battle of Frankenhausen. 5,000 peasants were slain, 3,000 afterward were beheaded. The total war, over 100,000 peasants lost their lives in battle. And over 75,000 were beheaded afterwards, bringing the total of the peasants' revolution to over 175,000 dead of the peasants. Just before this, there were some indications in Europe that this could take place. And prior to this time, Erasmus was really in favor of the Reformation. And he saw the conditions that were gaining fervor in Germany, and he backed away quickly. And he started to criticize Martin Luther and his Reformation. Martin Luther, I want to also add this, that Martin Luther was appalled by the revolution. That was what Martin Luther had in mind. That the revolution should not have taken place. The princes should have treated the peasants like part of the kingdom. And that that the peasants should have understood the godly authority or the God-given authority of the princes. Now, Erasmus always warned Martin Luther that that social revolution would take place. And so he could not jump on that bandwagon with him. But there were times when the church in Rome had made Erasmus, or tried to pin Erasmus down into where he would stand with the theological reformation of Martin Luther. And prior to this time of 1523, Erasmus' tendency toward supporting the Lutheran Reformation and saying so. Now, that had Erasmus removed from his position in the continental U.S. or continental Europe. Wow. Yeah, we're all of a sudden over here now, in the continental Europe, and which took Erasmus to England and Scotland, and he held positions in Oxford and Edinburgh. And I think that's very significant, because I believe that Erasmus has a big impact on the Reformation in Scotland and England, unwittingly. But remember this too: Henry VIII was vehemently opposed to Martin Luther. And even when Henry VIII started the English Reformation, he was still vehemently opposed to Martin Luther. And all he established was Catholicism. It's just that he became the Pope. The Reformation doesn't really take place in England, excepting for the Knox Reformation, in which during times of persecution, John Knox comes to the continent and studies with John Calvin, and studies John Calvin. He goes back to Scotland with his own Calvinism, and I want to say that he developed Calvinistic theology and applied it to Scotland, and I'm not sure that it was a very good application. It becomes very legalistic and severe in Scotland. And you can see that in the churches of Scotland. There's a reason why people don't go to church in Scotland, and it's because the churches are so ugly, because they've been gutted by the Presbyterians. Now, there's a reason why people do not go to church in Germany either. And it's not because of the beauty of the churches. Absolutely gorgeous. But it's because of the Augsburg Peace Accords, that Lutheranism did not need to become a state church and should not have become a state church. But the Augsburg Peace stated that the prince that is Lutheran would remain forever Lutheran, and that palace would stay Lutheran, and that would be the state church. The prince that was Catholic would remain Catholic, and his province or his principality would remain Catholic. And it is to that day, and those lines are there. Now, what that did was that destroyed evangelism in Germany. You know that you could not go into a Catholic and evangelize a Catholic province. Now, where the true ministry is in parachurch organizations today. That the job of evangelism is being done by, of all people, the YMCA. And they're actually a pretty evangelical group for German standards. But what they do is the taxes go to the Lutheran Church, and the Lutheran Church hires the services of these parachurch organizations to minister because they cannot. And they know that. They know that, there are a few churches that have a draw. They're more modern churches. I attended a service in about 1,000-year-old church in Delmenhorst, just north of Delmenhorst. And I enjoyed the service. It was right out of the Lutheran Catechism liturgy, and it was wonderful. And the hymns were great. The hymns were terrific. And there was 14 of us in service, of which 8 of us were from America. And that's sad. That's sad. The church was incredible. The pipe organ, wonderful. The sermon was good. But there's just no incentive for the people. The church gets their tax money and that's it. And they will not go. They will just not go. Yet, I met many Germans who do not go to church, who I have no doubt about their salvation. Now, what's that all about? Well, by and large, that's the result of the Augsburg Peace. The Augsburg Peace that was written, it was part of the Confession. The Augsburg Confession was written by and large by Philip Melanchthon. Martin Luther certainly had his input into that, but it was written by Philip Melanchthon. And it was partly a conciliatory document. In other words, the design of it was to bring peace between the Catholics and the Protestants, but also between Lutheranism and Zwingliism. And that was the intent. It didn't happen because Martin Luther would not allow the Zwinglian princes to sign the Confession. Now, I know that Martin Luther was a intense man, and he would not budge on certain things, and one of those things that he would not budge was sacramentalism, or his understanding of the Eucharist, that he would not budge on consubstantiation. So as a result, he did not extend the hand fellowship with Zwingli, and it says that the difference, even though it may be great, the difference between Luther and Zwingli were that Luther felt that Zwingli was a socialist, that that he had some responsibility towards the peasants' revolt. That the theological issue of the Eucharist, Luther felt that Zwingli, in a sense, was almost Nestorian in keeping separate the humanity and the divinity of Christ. And that was an issue that Luther would not budge on also. But there were many princes who did sign. And I don't have my notes saying which ones. I had mentioned them earlier in one of the classes. I believe it was about the fourth session last week. I mentioned those. If one of them was Philip of Hesse, Frederick the Wise, John of Saxony, Ulrich of Anhalt. Help me out.
Yes, Ulrich von Anhalt.
Who were the others?
Oh.
There's two others. Do you have those notes?
I don't have those notes.
Okay. All right, I think I've got it here. Okay. Philip of Hesse, George of Brandenburg, Duke Ernst of Lüneburg, John of Saxony, Duke Francis of Lüneburg, Prince Wolfgang of Anhalt. Where's Ulrich? Oh, I know. That was Zwingli's first name, Ulrich Zwingli. Yeah. Okay. And of course, Frederick the Wise, or Frederick of Saxony. What this did was this solidified all of Saxony for Lutheranism. Now, mind you that the peace accord was not signed until after Luther's death, and the peace accord was not signed until about 1553. But these princes had a great deal to risk. That not only their lives, but all of their properties. And essentially what they had done by signing this confession was to declare war with Charles V, their emperor. Because along with the condemnation incurred by Luther, that also was with his supporters. They formed what they called the Schmalkald League, in which they fought a war, which ended tragically in 1547. The Schmalkald League was destroyed. And Charles V was victorious. Now, but at the same time, the Turks started to move in to Prussia. And as a result, Charles V had to deal with with the princes of the Schmalkald League, and he signed the Augsburg Peace Accords, of which he was very reluctant, but he needed their help to stave off the Turks. He did so, and one of the things that you will notice about Charles V, he always kept his word. That if he gave his word, that was good. And when the peace accord was signed, he maintained that and made sure he maintained that. But, believe me, Charles V was not very happy about that. He wanted to put an end once and for all to Protestantism. Now he could not, by his own peace treaty. And he was so distraught about that, that when he died, he had himself buried in such a way in the church floor that every time the priest would give the benediction, he would stand on his face. And he felt that that was his penance. Now, I think that is very interesting, because you don't get a notion of this until you go into the church, and there in the floors you see these stones, monument stones, and underneath those monuments are buried, are entombed, the princes. And so, and in rock in the St. Thomas Church is entombed in the St. Thomas Church. And of course, you aren't able to stand on his tomb. That is roped off. But even to this day, in that church, by Charles V's word, the priest stands on his face every time he pronounces benediction. So even to this day, that is done. That the priest, you will know if you go to that church, and I can't think of the name of the church. But if you go there, it's someplace in the south, like Stuttgart or someplace like that. But if you go there, you will see the priest giving the benediction, and he is right on top of the forehead of Charles V. The articles of the Augsburg Confession, and I'll read them to you. Article 1 is about God and about the understanding of the Nicene. Article 2 is about original sin. Article 3 about Christ's divine human personality, not separate. Now you see, that is where Luther had stated that a Zwingliite could not sign the confession because he felt that Zwingli was too Nestorian in nature. Article 4, justification by faith. And by the way, Philip Melanchthon put in here, or did not put in here, alone, where Martin Luther in justification by faith. And that was kind of a conciliatory move on the part of Philip Melanchthon to provide some definite consolation to Rome. Article 5, the ministry of the Word and Sacrament. Article 6, Christian obedience. Article 7 and 8, the Church. Article 9, baptism. Article 10, the Supper of the Lord. Article 11, confession, and this is a consolation to retain it. Article 12, penance, and this is an evangelical interpretation. This is one of the issues that they would not concede. Article 13, the use of the sacrament, is to increase faith. Article 14, ordination, is essential to the faith. Article 15, ecclesiastical rights. Article 16, civil government. Article 17, the return of Christ. Now mind you that these are just the subject matter, and they were developed in evangelical consolation there, but basically it was a very evangelical doctrine. Article 18, the bond of the will and the necessity of grace. Article 19, the cause of sin. Article 20, faith and works. Article 21, worship of saints and the sole mediatorship of Christ. And then part 2 of this, Article 22, was the withdrawal of the cup from the laity. 23, the celibacy of clergy, and that became an issue. Article 24, the sacrifice of the Mass. Article 25, compulsory auricular confession. Article 26, fasts and feasts. Article 27, monastic vows. Article 28, the secular power of bishops not to confound ecclesiastical and civil powers. Now, it covered all of the issues that came up in the 95 Theses. And it explained them quite well. If you do have an opportunity to take a look at the Augsburg Confession, I would suggest it. It's a very nice document. It's a very good document. There's another confession that you might want to look at, and this is an expansion of the Augsburg Confession, and that is the Heidelberg Confession. And essentially, the Heidelberg Confession is even closer to Luther than the Augsburg Confession. The Augsburg Confession is more Philip Melanchthon. The Heidelberg is more Luther. And yet, as a document, it wasn't developed by Martin Luther. It was developed sometime afterwards. By the way, the Heidelberg Confession is used by the not the PCA, that the Westminster Confession is used by the PCA, or Presbyterian Church in America. Reformed Churches of America, the RCA, and the what's the other group? Reformed Church in America is out of Grand Rapids, and the other group, I can't think of them, but they're also a Reformed group. That is used by those groups, and I just absolutely loved the Heidelberg Confession. It was very complete. It was very well done, very well done. As a result of the Lutheran Reformation, Luther really died a very distraught man. Felt that the theological Reformation had taken place, and yet the people were not changed by it. That the peasants were still animals, and that the princes were still mean and nasty, and that they mistreated the peasants. And so he died a very distraught man. Now, I think that in retrospect, I think that Erasmus was probably right in many ways. That the theological Reformation would give opportunity for groups to fight. But at the same time, it would not reform them socially. That those groups would not treat each other any better than they did before the theological Reformation. And this really bothered Luther. And one of the reasons why Erasmus held that position was that it would not bring about a change of holiness, or it would not bring about a change of devotion. Not for centuries. Now, I think that maybe, in a sense, Erasmus was wrong there, that I believe that it did bring about a change in devotion. But it did not define the church well enough to understand or make the understanding that all the church is a body gathered together of sinners saved by grace. And so in allowance for that, and in the knowledge of that, then it created its own problems. Or excuse me, without the knowledge of that, it created its own problems. In other words, groups thinking that they are more devout than other groups and conducting extreme persecution from Protestant group to Protestant group. There were many issues going to take place within the Reformation. By the Elizabethan period, the Reformation is dead in the continent of Europe. That it's not going anywhere. And Rome figures that out. It stopped the Reformation in several ways. One is Counter-Reformation. The other is the Renaissance. It used the Renaissance and the Counter-Reformation to infiltrate and to plug in back into Reformation theology the very things of medieval scholasticism that were eliminated. Pelagianism comes back into the scene, only this time it's in the Protestant churches. Now that is the very reason why you have the Westminster Confession. That was brought about by the Council of Dort to bring its, oh man, I love it. It was brought about by the Council of Dort to bring a response to Arminianism and a response to Remonstrantism. And we will talk about that when we get closer to the English Reformation. We will close off the German Reformation, and before we do, I want to open it up for any questions on the German Reformation. You have a very good timeline here that will keep you kind of in a sequence. What I would suggest is that in your textbooks, that as you read or as you look at this, take a look at what it says in here about the Council of Spire, for instance, or the Schmalz League, and it'll be in the index. Look it up and see what Pelikan says about that. About the Augsburg Peace, or about the Augsburg Confession.
I'm just curious.
Yes.
I'm just curious that as you go along in the time frame, the way he approached it and the response he got back from the peasants, which threw everything in disarray, why did he take that route? Why did he not break it down? Because they in turn why did he take that route?
Why did Luther, the question is, why did Luther take the route that he did, understanding or that there would be the peasant revolution? Ultimately, that isn't the route that Luther took. In fact, because it was led by the radical reformers, who had gone way off the fanatic end of the theological Reformation, put it solely in a social order, and flogged that to the people. They incited the peasants. Thomas Müntzer incited the peasants to revolt against the princes. And remember this, that the princes were too believers, and they were part of the church.
But didn't Luther leave himself open for that?
In a sense, he did. It's the very criticism that Erasmus had with Luther, and yet understanding this, that Erasmus's friendship with Luther in the beginning was, I think, real strong. And I believe that Erasmus himself was very reluctant to take the position that he did, but he was forced to by the hand of Rome. Erasmus wasn't going to go that direction. He actually went the way that Luther should have or wanted to.